our next segment after that powerful conversation. Thank you, everybody, again. We're going to move on to our next lecture, which is on environmental legacies and Franco-American legacies in Maine's mill towns. We have our two speakers, Kerri Arsenault and David Vermette. I hope I said that right.
Fine.
So just some background. Kerri is a book critic and book editor at Orion Magazine and a contributing editor at the Literary Hub. She is also a mentor for PEN's America's Prison and Justice Writing Program. She received an MFA from the New School and studied in the master's program in communication for development at Malmö University, Sweden. That's super cool. Her work has appeared in the Boston Globe, Down East, Literary Hub, Air Hail, Freeman's, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and Orion. She has her first book, Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains. Also, we have David Vermette. He is a writer, researcher, and editor. He is the author of the book, A Distinct Alien Race, she has right there, The Untold Story of Franco-Americans, Montreal Baraka Books, 2018. He is a frequent speaker at colleges, universities, and historical and genealogical societies. Sorry about that. He was born and raised in Massachusetts. So if you guys want to take it away with your amazing lecture, that'd be awesome.
Sure.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks very much for having us. Just going to let you know what we're going to do here today. We're each going to just talk a little bit about our work, and then we're going to have a conversation about some of the common themes that thread through these books. So Kerri, maybe you can start us off by telling us about your new book, Milltown, beautifully written book, and maybe you can tell these folks a little bit about it.
Okay, thanks, David, and thanks, Bread and Roses. So Milltown just came out on September 1st. It's a narrative nonfiction book about the small paper mill towns of Rumford and Mexico, Maine, where for 3 generations my family worked. The book is a blend of memoir, investigative journalism, cultural criticism that examines how our landscapes define us and how we define our landscapes. It's a very broad overview of it, but critic John Freeman said he said it better, maybe. It's a complex love letter to a hometown and an insight to the unbuilding of an American dream. When I began researching, I'll just briefly, when I began researching my family tree, I began to see how our lives and our deaths actually are and were intertwined with this paper mill, my Acadian ancestry, my Franco-American and Acadian ancestry, I should say, and how that was intertwined with the past, and mostly how we relied upon the very thing that was killing us, paper making. It's a very toxic industry. So because of the high rates of cancer in our town, I started looking at that aspect too. And one of the book's central questions is this: who or what are we willing to sacrifice for our own survival? And where my book intersects with David is pretty much everywhere. They're written very differently, but our stories intersect on so many levels. I would say, first of all, using our own families to give our books their narrative thrust. The beginning of his book too, I love this. I read the intro again this morning. The beginning of his finds us looking at like a cemetery, a Catholic cemetery in 1983, where he sees all these like names, these French names on the gravestones. And my research actually had its genesis right there too, when my father and I went to Prince Edward Island in 2001, and I saw a similar cemetery in the fading light of day up in Prince Edward Island, and saw all these names etched into the gravestone design that I was familiar with. Anyway, from there, both David and I sought, I think, to unbury and illuminate the untold stories of those ancestors, to examine their myths and their legacies, and to turn, as David said, I love this, information into stories. And yeah, so that's where I start.
Okay.
And do you want me to talk about the theme too, or do you want to start there?
Yeah, I'll just say a little bit about my
Yeah.
book, and then we'll throw it back and we'll talk about that theme of invisibility. My book is called "The Distinct Alien Race: The Untold Story of Franco-Americans," and it discusses the development of the textile industry in towns like Lawrence and Lowell and many others, and the French Canadians who made up the largest cohort of these textile workers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that title, A Distinct Alien Race, that comes from a Boston newspaper from 1889 that stated that these French Canadian immigrants were being, quote, kept a distinct alien race, unquote. I was really struck by that because it really typifies a lot of the rhetoric around these immigrants in that period. And my approach to the story was to kind of reframe an old story and make it relevant to the present day, primarily in three ways. First, the French Canadians in New England were really deeply embedded in the cotton economy. And cotton was the biggest agricultural product in the United States and the biggest manufacturing product in the United States of the 19th century. So I relate this story of French Canadians in New England to the whole story of cotton in the United States. If you followed the 1619 Project, you know how important cotton was to the development of the economic history of the United States. A second theme in my book, I think is really relevant today, is cross-border immigration. And by that I mean immigrants who aren't coming from overseas to the United States, they're crossing a land border into the US. And I show that there were special concerns that go along with this type of immigration, be it from the North or from the South. For example, back in the late 19th century, there were fears that these French Canadians were trying to take over New England, you know, that they were gonna take over and then they were gonna annex New England to a newly independent Quebec, and they were going to revive New France. It sounds ludicrous today, but that type of concern was not likely to be too much of a big deal with respect to immigrants from, say, Greece or Russia. You know, there wasn't going to be fears of that Greece was going to take over New England. The third theme really is fear of the other. And this is a really tough one, and it goes to the conversation that we were just having, is that, believe it or not, the French Canadians in New England in those days were seen as really other than the Yankee Protestants who were there in New England at that time. They were spoken of as an entirely separate race of people who were trying to crowd out the, quote, real Americans, unquote, and that they were seen as a threat to the Anglo-Protestant character of the country. If all that sounds familiar, it should. So, you know, let's talk about this theme of invisibility, Kerri. This is something that goes really deeply in both of our books. You know, maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, other invisibility, I guess. Yeah. So on my book, I think I seek to reveal a lot of different invisible stories. I mean, the big one of them is the ethnic cleansing of Acadians from the maritime provinces that has been written about historically, but maybe not in such a narrative nonfiction or a memoir, at least here in the US. That's one story. Another story is the story of the working class in America. And it specifically is told from inside the working class of America. Like, I feel, you know, there's been a lot of reporters sort of helicoptering into these small towns in America and telling stories and then helicoptering out. And I feel like I grew up in this town. My mother and father still lived there while I was writing this book, and my family and generations of people have been buried there. And I have a deep connection to the people and a deep affection for this place and the people. And I felt like telling that story from the inside out was something that hadn't been told. It was an invisible kind of story, that working class story, which is also a story in the periphery of the larger American conversation, I think, particularly nearing this election. The working class, there's a lot of invisibility on that part and a lot of misunderstanding. So when we say invisibility, I think it's too about misconceptions and misunderstandings. The other story that's really quite big that I haven't really talked about is the story of toxicity and the kind of slow violence that had been occurring in my town. And when I say slow violence, what I mean is a violence of toxic chemicals that is largely out of sight. And it affects, there was such a large number of cancers in our town and still remain, that, but it's a kind of a story that's not in the news. It's not, like I was telling David earlier, it's not like Chernobyl, or it's not like a hurricane came in. It's very slow, attritional, invisible violence that has been happening over the better part of a century, because this mill's been in operation for over 100 years. So these stories are really hard to tell because they're not newsy. You know, how do you write about something that's happened for 100 years? It's a history book, right? So anyway, I wanted to try to sort of reveal these silenced stories. And David, you also are doing that too. I've read David's book a couple of years ago when it came out, and it was so informative to my own writing. I wish I had had it 10 years ago, unfortunately, when I started my book, but it came in at the last minute. But you talk too about the invisibilities in your book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that this whole story that I wrote about these French Canadian and Acadian immigrants is completely invisible. You know, at a certain point, the elite coined this term Franco-American to describe them. And in fact, outside of New England, a Franco-American is a brand of canned pasta. You know, that's all that is. And even within New England, it's very little known or understood. And you know, it's interesting because I've gotten some pushback from some people on that, because they say, oh, well, you know, in Nashua, we have a statue about Franco-Americans. And in Brunswick, Maine, we have a plaque on a bridge, you know, and we also have our Franco-American parishes, you know, that the Catholic Church is rapidly dismantling. And they'll say, well, you know, then there's all the history that's in the parish records of Quebec. And that response makes my point about the invisibility, because it's entirely inside baseball. You know, it's like, if you're not an insider, you don't know anything about that stuff. If you don't know where to look, you won't find any of that. And that really speaks to the absence of this story on a national level. You know, and everybody would like to think that their ancestors' story is important, right? But this is not an important story because they're my ancestors or because I say so. It's important because of all of the areas of history that it touches. In the intro to my book, I use the word tentacular. It's got these tentacles that are like sticking in all these different like pools of history. It's like a parable that illumines so many things that are going on today, like about immigration, about the limits of unregulated corporations. It goes right back even to the origins of corporate America. And another thing I'd say is that this story was important in its day. It was very much covered by the mainstream media. And this is something that other tellings of this story really haven't touched on. Publications like the New York Times, Harper's, The Nation covered this extensively. The New York Times covered it pillar to post, like for 15 years. It was hammering on this news story. You know, it was a semi-big deal in its day. So, you know, one of the things that I'm hearing here in this conversation is that both of our books are kind of correctives to some, you know, inadequate or maybe even sentimental tellings of the story. So, you know, Kerri, maybe you could talk about how your book is a corrective to prevailing narratives.
Yeah, first I want to say that, you know, I love what David just said about the origins to corporate America. Both of our stories are like that. In fact, our paper mill was founded by the man who began International Paper, which is the largest paper company in the world. So it's not just a story about a small town. It's not just a story about Franco-Americans. It's really the larger industrial story. And here we are, Lawrence, Mass. Yay.
Right.
But as for the correctives, yeah. My story not only seeks to reveal those invisible things, but also the correctives. Like I take on some real big myths like Paul Bunyan, Anne of Green Gables, which in fact is, as a book critic, I really couldn't resist. I mean, you know, a lot of that writing's pretty racist, and I feel comfortable using the R word there. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem Evangeline, which sort of co-opted the ethnic cleansing myth. And, you know, Wadsworth wrote from his downtown Protestant living room. He'd never stepped foot in Prince Edward Island when he wrote that poem. What does he know? Also, the myth, a big myth too, is the myth of Maine as vacation land. Raise your hand if you've been to Maine. I mean, I grew up there. David knows Maine. Yes. I mean, if we think of everything as blueberry cobbler and lobsters, then we ignore people like, and if you read my book, you may never eat lobster again. But if we think of everything as that, and LL Bean and like roasting hot dogs on a fire, then you're ignoring, you know, as a tourist, you're ignoring things that are happening in the peripheries, such as what's happened in my town. And if you're ignoring that, then you're leaving and you're going back home and you think everything's okay. And if you think everything's okay, it's just getting worse for people in those towns. So I really wanted to bring their stories forward and correct what was, you know, happening there. It's not a forced primeval in Maine all the time, even though Longfellow said it was. It's downright primeval in some parts. I mean, I say that with no joke. I mean, my town has 4 to 5 kids are food insecure. There's an opioid crisis, of course, everywhere. There's joblessness, there's poverty, there's despair, there's economic despair in this working class town. And then paper making is also dying, a dying thing. So what's gonna happen when that leaves? I do not know. I don't know. It's part of their identity, you know, as David talks about too in the book. But speaking of, yes, I should give you some time to talk about your myth, the myths that you're correcting too. I mean, whether it's an untold story or a retold story.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, talk about sentimental tellings, Evangeline, you know, by Longfellow, and it's an example of that kind of sentimental gloss on history. But, you know, I think one of the correctives in my book is that, you know, many of the French Canadian descendants in New England today, a lot of them are older people who identify with this history. You know, they tend to think that they were really different from immigrants today. You know, they want to make this sharp distinction between themselves and earlier immigrants. And they want to say, you know, we were hardworking and faithful and we fit in easily into the United States. And, you know, yeah, they worked really hard and they certainly were faithful to their religion, but the reception of the French Canadian immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century and the reception of immigrants today were really similar in many respects. The rhetoric around some of these different immigrant groups, or it's just remarkably similar. It's one of the comments I get from people when they read my book, is they see the mirror, you know, they say, wow, you know, that sounds just like something someone would write today about immigration. And in fact, that they did not fit easily into the United States of that time at all. In fact, they were very adamant, for the most part, about keeping their French Canadian identity and their French language within the United States, just as they had done in Canada. You know, they had fought to preserve their French Canadian identity under British rule up in Canada for, you know, 100 years before they started coming here to the United States, really in any great numbers. So they really fought to try to not assimilate to United States culture. And there's another corrective is that the French Canadians, both then and in some of the history books now, the adjective docile is often used to describe them. They were law-abiding and docile.
Look at us. I mean, come on. Yeah.
Yes and no.
I'm kidding.
That they did have a great respect for authority, particularly the authority of the church, but they were very much involved in strikes, some of them quite violent. I can't remember the number, but I think there was something like a half dozen strikes in the Cabot Mill up in Brunswick, Maine, a mill that I studied very closely in my book. In like a 5-year period, there were like 6 strikes. One of them was led by 9 to 14-year-old boys, walked off the job, and then the adults followed these boys off the job. The strike after that was started by women. So, you know, contrary to popular belief, they did fight for their rights. And in fact, William Morin, in his book, The Bells of New England, generally a good book, he claims that the French Canadians basically left town when the Bread and Roses strike broke out in Lawrence. And in fact, that's not true. The Franco-American priests there donated money to the strikers. If you know anything about the kind of attitudes of the Quebecois Catholic clergy, you know that that's really unusual thing for him to do. And in fact, all of the communiques about the strike were translated into 50 different languages. You know, at that time, 50 different languages were spoken in Lawrence. And in fact, French was one of those languages. That definitely speaks to the fact that the French-speaking workers were involved in that. And so that they were capable of standing up for themselves. And I would add, they also fought bitterly against the Irish hierarchy in the Catholic Church there in New England, fought for their rights too. But you know, that there's one really important thing that we have to touch on in the time that we have, Kerri, and that's just the environmental impact of the Milltown experience. It's a really central theme in your book. It's I like to call it the toxicity of poverty. You know, tell us about that environmental impact aspect of your book.
Yeah, I love that term, the toxicity of poverty. And in fact, this also is applicable to Lawrence. I mean, Lawrence, all these mill towns, this is not just my town. So listen up, everybody. The toxicity of poverty, I think about that as the cancer rates. And first of all, the cancer rates in our town were so high that WCVB out of Boston did a 2-part show, one in 1991 and 2001, called Cancer Valley, about our town, like an investigative magazine show. So just to give you a very brief background on that. But what it is about poverty and toxicity is that people living in sacrifice zones is a term, meaning people living in these sort of either edges or in liminal spaces or near industry, or living in literal sacrifice zones, meaning they're more susceptible to environmental injustices where the wealthy are not, or even less wealthy, or, you know, less poor, I guess. But you know, it's a matter of downwind or upwind. Who lives upwind? Who lives downwind? You know, it's just been proven in study after study after study. It's usually occupied by people of the working class, who are treated like literal garbage, or, as I was telling David earlier, recycling units for industry. Really, I mean, if you take all that stuff that goes up in the air, it's got to come down somewhere. Well, it's coming inside our bodies, and no more proof could I find than when my father died halfway through the book, but in the last years of his life, he had lung cancer from working in the mill via asbestosis. I was doing research on the Androscoggin River, which at one time was one of the most polluted rivers in the United States. And then I was also researching his cancer, and they were virtually the same. They were pumping oxygen in his body, and they were pumping oxygen in the river. And they were measuring the oxygen in his blood, and they were measuring the oxygen in the river. It was like, he was a complete recycling unit for industry, just like the river was. I mean, the environmental impact of that town upon not just our families, but everything goes downriver, and it ends up in the Atlantic Ocean, it ends up in fish, and we eat the fish, and then and it goes up the food chain. Speaking of going downriver, so David's town, so mine was Rumford in Mexico, Maine. David's town was basically downriver or downwind from my town. So tell me about your sort of environmental interface with industry down there.
Yeah, I should say first of all that I used Brunswick, Maine as a case study in my book, but my book is not a local history. It talks about the textile industry throughout New England, including in the Merrimack Valley. But yes, I did use the Cabot Mill of Brunswick, Maine as a sort of case study that runs through my book, and that's because it's my dad's hometown. So again, it's a family story that's woven in there. But yeah, downriver in Brunswick, it's an interesting story because there was about 40 years where locals tried to start a textile mill there in Brunswick. And in fact, the Lawrence brothers were involved in funding some of that in the early days. But then eventually Boston Capital came up to Maine in the form of the Cabot family, you know, that very prominent Boston family. They came out up to Maine and they bought out the locals. They bought out a failing mill. So the capital came from Boston for that mill. The profits went back to Boston from that mill. And they didn't employ local Mainers. They imported this workforce from Quebec to work in these mills. And in 1920, 90% of all the people who worked in that textile mill were of French Canadian origin. And so they housed these workers in these rattle-trap tenements that were down by the river that were just horribly overcrowded. And there were repeated epidemics of typhoid and diphtheria that went through these tenements. They just had really horrible child mortality that I detail in my book. You know, in very great detail I go into about that in the book. So where's Maine in all this? You know, it's not that they're not employing Mainers. The money that comes from Boston goes back there. So Maine is the water power. Maine is the energy. You know, Maine is the river itself, which of course the cotton production, and then a little bit later, rayon production really polluted the heck out of that river. So they got what they could out of Maine, and then they sold that out and they left. So it's really kind of a strip mining. It's like strip mine capitalism.
Resource extraction,
Resource
extraction. It's a story. So our stories are the story of the United States of America, and unfortunately, a lot of capitalism, late capitalism. But I just wanted to, before we go to Q&A, because we only have a few minutes left, I just wanted to say, David mentioned the word docile for Franco-Americans, and as you can see, neither of us are. We're here to make trouble. So please let us make trouble for you. Are there any questions out there?
And before we go there, I just will mention that in the chat box, I put links to both of our books. So anyway.
That was fun. I think we should have a podcast about Franco-Americans, right? Anybody up for that?
I think I appreciate both of you guys, the work that you guys done. I mean, for me personally, I'm from Lawrence, and learning that it wasn't just, Lawrence and Lowell that was facing these issues. It's kind of, surprising to me. And I'm glad you guys were able to write books and research about it so I could learn more. Also, just to know on the fact of the lobsters, I just recently learned about that. And oh my goodness, it's true. It's for anybody who wants to know, it's just lobsters were first known as poor people food, and were fed to prisoners and slaves, and
Wait, let me tell you something more horrifying.
Oh no, more.
So the main chemical, there's some chemicals, let's just say, they go downriver in our river and they end up in the Atlantic Ocean, and they're the most dangerous chemicals known to humankind, and they are in the lobsters. And you probably couldn't catch me eating a lobster anymore after researching my book. So they come from the paper making industry specifically, and textile industries too. They're called bioaccumulative toxics, and they get in your bloodstream and they go up the food chain. So currently, right now, the babies breastfeeding from their mother are receiving 77 times the amount of dioxins that are recommended by the EPA, which is basically legacy dioxins. These are legacies, things that have been put in the environment years ago. So in the lobsters.
Yeah, Denise, I can confirm that lobsters were poor people food, through my family, because Kerri and I are actually cousins. We share this PEI Acadian background, and my grandmother grew up on Prince Edward Island, Canada, and she said when you didn't have anything to eat, her mom would say, yeah, go down and get some lobster, pull some lobster out of the water. That was the food of last resort.
So I do have two questions for you. One, let me, present Elizabeth, who has a question for you, both of you.
Thanks, Denise. I'm totally pulling privilege of being the tech person behind the scenes here. So thank you both. This was great. And one of the things, so I read Kerri's book. It's fantastic. Everyone should get it. I haven't read David's yet, but it's on my list. One of the questions I have is that when I read the book, so much of it was familiar to me being from Michigan. So in Michigan, I was saying to Jim earlier, there was a disaster where in the 70s, most people think of the Flint water crisis, and that's more recent, but in the 70s, there was accidentally a load of flame retardants put into cattle feed, and basically anyone who was alive in Michigan in the 70s, or anyone who breastfed from them, has elevated levels of PCBs in their bloodstream, which includes me. And so it is another of these legacy kind of toxins. And so I was just struck by how much of the kind of I think Kerri, you said something at the beginning, the invisibility of the working class, and the way that that story resonated so much with me. It resonated with what I had heard when I was living in the Pacific Northwest in terms of the timber industry there. It resonated in terms of, I just read Elizabeth Katz's What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia, which is has a lot of the same themes. And I'm just wondering if, even though this is a very specific story, if folks, as you kind of travel and talk to people about these books, ask you oh, this sounds just like my community. Sounds exactly like what we went through.
Hundreds of emails coming in saying, this is just like me in DeKalb, this is like me in Michigan, this is like in Oregon or Canada. And it all has those themes of invisibility, sacrifice zones, you know, isolated. It doesn't even have to be a small town, but like really just kind of people living in the periphery, which I include working class, because the working class hasn't been really configured into our politics or of concern at all in our nation, I think, for the past 40, 50, 60, maybe ever. I don't know if they've ever had, you know, like Make America Great Again. Well, was it ever great? I mean, it was, yes, I got an education. I got up and out of the working class, and now I'm a writer. I don't know if that's better. And my father made way more money than me, but I got up and out of, I was poisoned as a child, you know, like you say, Elizabeth, you know, you're basically poisoned. Was that great? I don't know. I have questions. Anything, David, want to add to that?
We might have a few more questions.
Yes, I have a two-part question from Jim Bioshensny. I'm so sorry, Jim, that I butchered your last name. There we go. I'm terrible with names. But his first question and comment was, quote, he said, "Sorry, but my grandfather was one of those French Canadians who left Lawrence during the Bread and Roses strike to find work elsewhere." Yes. But and also to mention Carol Wright's statement in 1881. And his question is, do you think the docility question, which I've seen before, is related to Quebecois versus Acadian cultural difference?
David?
Really don't. Yeah, the first part, your grandfather who left Lawrence during the Bread and Roses strike, there were many people who were planning on going back to Quebec. They were trying to come here to save their money and then go back and shore up the family farm back in Quebec. There were other people who had left the family farm in Quebec. There was nothing for them to go back to, and so they had to make it in those mill towns. And these were two different groups. And yes, they did have different attitudes. So some of those folks were saying, no, we're not going to stay here and fight. We're going to go to Haverhill or Lowell and get a job over there. But in fact, a lot of them did stay and fight. And in fact, we can fight about that later if you want. In terms of the Quebecois versus Acadian, I'm really not sure. I think the docility theme really runs through both of those communities. Yes, I'm well aware of the Carol Wright report. You know, that is quoted in Kerri's book and in my book. It's quoted in every history of the Franco-Americans that I've read. And basically what that report said, for people who don't know, is it said that the French Canadians were, quote, the Chinese of the eastern states, meaning that they would just save their money here in New England and then go back to Canada. It described them as a horde of industrial invaders and not a stream of stable settlers. It was extremely derogatory. It described them as a low and sordid people. And in fact, that report, there was such outrage about that report that there was a hearing about it at the Massachusetts State House in Boston in October of 1881, where the French Canadian element in New England defended themselves, and they were very upset indeed that these kind of slanderous, very personal slanders were put into an official report of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
I see this question from Joan over here on the side. I don't know if you're seeing that question, but she says, can you talk about our experience, our experience, she's including her and us, as visibly white people in sacrifice zones can position us better as allies for our Black and brown neighbors. I want to say one thing about that, and it's something I've been thinking about, is that something that, my book is not political, there's no political agenda, but I do want to say that I think the right has been very successful, maybe even since the Civil War, in dividing the working class into white and brown and Black factions. So what I'm trying to do is not take that binary view of it. I'm just saying working class, sacrifice zone, people that are living it, whether you're in New Orleans living as a person of color, or if you're in, you know, Maine living as, you know, in the whitest state in the nation. We're all working class, and I don't want to make those divides anymore. I want to be more inclusive, and maybe that's how it can help, is just put people under the umbrella, not go with what the extreme right is trying to do by dividing us. That's how I feel. There are books about it.
I see that our time is getting close. Do we want to throw it back to our organizers?
Yes, thank you so much for your time, Kerri and David. We're gonna move to Tom's. Tom is gonna have a little conversation about the Bread and Roses, the evolution of song, labor, song books, and union culture. Thank you again, Kerri and David. If you guys want to stick around to answer any questions that you guys see in the chat and to hear more about our other speakers, that'd be great. But thank you so much.